drive for an 8.8 in a V6 Mustang. We're going to jump right into this one today. First thing you're going to want to do is get the jack underneath the axle and jack the car up to transfer the weight from the rear subframe and the jack stands to sitting on the coil springs, and then tighten up your control arms. Because if you tighten up your control arms with the axle at full drop, once you put the car back on the tires, you're going to get binding in your bushings, and your bushings are going to wear out quick. So you do it like this to have everything settle and center before you set the car on its tires. So let's jump right into it and get it done. Alright guys, since we've got the rear end done, I've got a few more parts here that I stole out of the car that the rear end came out of. Got some hop shocks and a sway bar. The 04 Mustang V6 didn't come with it, and we're going to add it in today. We'll go ahead and get these thrown in, and then we'll get to modifying the fuel line to add my post filter. And before I forget, I'll show you the pump setup. We've got the feed line, return line, pre-filter, of course the pump, and this is the feed line going to the front to the regulator, and I've got to modify this to accommodate the post filter. And I've also got some heat shielding to wrap these with to protect them from the exhaust pipe. Alright, we've got to remove the parking brake cable bracket on the lower control arm on both sides. we'll move on to the hop shocks. We've got to mount the bracket, and then they normally go in like this, but the fatter end usually contacts the wheels when you go with a wider rim and fatter tire. So we flip them around, put the fatter end on the inside, and then it gives your rim a little bit more clearance. Alright guys, got the hop shocks all mounted up and the sway bar. She ought to drive like a whole new car. This would be a good time to check my wheel fitment. Alright guys, moment of truth. Well, at first glance, it looks like it fits. I will climb up under here and check it out. Good and tight. Nothing's touching. We're about a ½ an inch from the hop shock and about a ½ an inch from the parking brake cable bracket, which I bent down just a hair, but nothing's rubbing on the passenger side. Good to go. Now that the rear end is finished, we need to move on to the post filter and where I want to mount my bracket. I am going to need to modify this lip so this will fit where I want it, and then I need to split my line and put two 90-degree AN fittings there. Alright guys, I'm going to give you a crash course on how to use a rivet nut gun. So, once you determine what size fitting you need, it'll tell you on the packaging it's an M6. And then you have a die that matches. So you have an M6, pull that out, you have two pieces. So you give this a little squeeze, loosen this up, this will spin off. This is under a spring load. So screw this in. Don't run it in super tight, just snug to where it'll line up. Not even snug, just a little gap. And then it'll line up with this and that'll keep it from spinning. Then you take this piece, put it back on, and then this will seat it. Squeeze it all the way down, put this piece in, and then your rivet nut goes on here. And then you squeeze it and it crushes down on this piece right here. And if your hands are too small to squeeze this all the way down, you start out a little bit, tighten it a little bit more, tighten it a little bit more until you can't squeeze it anymore. But that's pretty much the gist of it, and it works pretty well. Alright, I need to split this fuel line, and if you don't have the proper fuel line tools, what you can do is wrap this in electrical tape and then use a cutoff wheel to cut through the braid. And I don't recommend doing this if you have fuel in your lines, which I blew mine out with an air compressor, so it should be good. I'm only going to cut through the outer surface with the grinder, and then I'll use my razor knife to finish the cut. And I only have 190, so I'm gonna put the 90 here, and then I have a 180. I'm gonna put that here, and it should work just fine. Guys, next up I've got this heat shielding for my fuel lines. It comes with some little metal bands and some gloves, and can't remember exactly how many feet this is, but we're going to open this up and see about getting it installed on the fuel lines. It seems to be about 8 to 10 feet long, and you can cut it down to size in sections and wrap around your fuel lines and the Velcros. Let's get to it. Alright, got all the heat shielding installed on my hoses. And now to move on to straightening out the pinch welds. One of the last things on my list, I've got to make a gauge pod for my 2 gauges in my center console, and then we'll be done. Far from perfect, but a lot better. I'll need some epoxy sealer to put on the pinch welds, keep them from rusting up, but looks good to me. On to the gauge pod. I don't have a conventional stereo system. I've just got an amp with a Bluetooth module, so there's nothing in the stereo location. So for my gauge pod, I think I'm going to use this stereo install kit and this piece of press board, and I'm going to 2-part epoxy that in here, throw some black paint on it. I think that'll look real good versus having to drill holes in my dash or anything like that to mount a pod. And then also here I'll Dremel a small hole and I'll be able to mount my battery light for my alternator right here, and in the case that my alternator quits charging, I'll be able to see it illuminating inside this hole here, which isn't really big enough to benefit anything. Can't really put anything in there. So I'll get these holes Dremeled out, glue this in, and get it ready to go in the car. I don't really like how this gauge sticks out more. So I think I'm going to do something to try to bring this gauge out as well so they're even. But I think it'll look pretty good. So the gauges come with these little sun visor things. And to make the gauges sit about the same, what I did is I cut this around this lip with a hacksaw blade to make the gauge sit about flush with this one. And then the gauge keeper on the back, I had to trim off the same amount from that as I did on this piece. But I think it turned out pretty good. Let's get it in the car. Alright guys, she's done. Unfortunately, I thought I was recording and I wasn't. This is my AFR gauge. This is my fuel pressure gauge. There's no fuel lines running into my car to this gauge. It's run by a sensor under the hood. So don't worry, I have no raw fuel running into the cabin of the car. With this AFR gauge, you've got to turn the key to the on position and it'll run through its calibration mode to actually heat up the O2 sensor before you start the car, which is important due to if there's any condensation or anything in your exhaust, it'll ruin your O2 sensors. So I'll go ahead and fire it up for you and let you see the gauges. I've got my battery light mounted in there and everything looks pretty good. Like I said, I don't have a conventional radio. I just got a Bluetooth module, so I don't need the space for stereo, which is why I put the gauges there. I think they look pretty good. Unfortunately, the white lights in the gauge look pink on the AFR gauge, so I went with the blue. It doesn't really look too bad, so I'll go ahead and fire it up. And you want your AFR gauge to read Stoich, which is between 12.9 and 17.9, and it'll bounce around a little bit at idle. And I've got mine as close to 17.9 as possible, trying to get a decent fuel economy out of it. But she's pretty much done, guys. I've got a few little things to button up, some cleaning up to do. I got some interior panels and stuff to put back on, windshield wipers and such. But I'm going to do a full detail, clean it up real good, and then I'll do a final reveal on it. And I'm going to recalibrate my speedometer, and then we'll go for a quick cruise. Speedometer's calibrated. I accidentally put it too many miles on there, but it's resettable, so excuse my dirty windshield. We'll go for a quick drive and see how she runs. pretty good. Haven't seen any issues yet. Stay tuned for the final reveal. Do a detail on it, get it cleaned up, and we'll see you on the next one.